Okay, so I'm going to pick up from where we left off last class. So the last class I had just gone through the the real world examples of what integer overflow, or sorry, real world examples of where integer overflow has happened. Sorry, hang on. All right. So for the time being, that's all I want to say about int. Double. So when you're working with floating point values, normally you choose double as your type. So double corresponds to float in Python, which is a little confusing because there's also a float type in Java. The float type in Java holds a smaller range of values than double. So again, because the primitive types all occupy a fixed amount of memory, there has to be some minimum and some maximum value, or there has to be some range of values that that double can represent. The largest double value that you can, the largest non-infinite double value that you can represent is this thing called double dot max value. It's very big, so it's about 10 to the power 308. The most negative finite value that you can represent is just the negative of high, right? So it's roughly minus 10 to the power 308. Now, double is a bit different than int in that there's min value is not the largest negative value like it is with integer. So min value for double is the smallest positive value. I don't actually know what the number is off the top of my head, but it's very small. So it's 10 to the minus some large number. Right. So in other words, it's 0 point many zeros and then some number. Right? So you have to be a little bit careful when you use. Oops. You have to be a little bit careful to not confuse double min value with integer min value. They mean different things for the two types. A double literal is any number that you write down that has a decimal in it, and it does not end in F or F, big F or little f. So if you write a number down and it ends with F or big F or little f, then that's a float literal. Right? So double literals just look like numbers written down with a decimal place in it. Right. So 1 decimal 0 is a double literal. 2 decimal is also a double literal. Right. If you just have the number 1 or just the number 2, then it's an int literal. All numeric literals, you're allowed to use the underscore inside of them to make writing down larger numbers easier to read. Let's see. So floats and doubles in Java allow you to use what's called scientific notation. So you may have seen this in your Python course. You may not. Python also allows you to write numbers like this. If you write down a number and then follow that with an E, and then follow that with an integer value, this is a number in what's called scientific notation. So this number here is 1 point something. The E means times 10 to the power 6. Okay? So that power has to be an integer value. It can be negative, but it has to be an integer value. So once again, that's 1.00000099 times 10 to the power 6. That's often used in scientific and engineering applications. Second here, someone seems to be. Okay. All right. Now, arithmetic with doubles works the way, more or less the way you would expect it to for for common values, for common double values, right? So there's some unusual double values that I'll talk about later. You can also read about them in the double notebook. Ian, just a second, I have to, okay. So for example, if I have the numbers, 1, 3, and 13, all as double values, right? So this is important, right? The fact that these, the fact that these types here, X, Y, and Z are double is important. right? So these are the exact same values that I used for the int slide. If you add them together, you get 4.0, right? X and Y, 1 and 3 is 4.0. So everything works the way you expect it to, including division, right? So 1 divided by 3 gives you back 0.33 dot, 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 right? Z divided by Y, so 13 divided by 3 gives you back 4 and a bit, right? You can use parentheses to group stuff together, right, to make sure it happens first. So what is that, 17 divided by 3 is 5.666 dot, dot, dot. So any operation involving two double values always produces a double value. Now, that means there's an issue when you try to compute something and the value doesn't fit inside the range of double. So unlike int, doubles do not wrap around. So instead of wrapping around, floating point computations saturate. Saturate means they become positive infinity or negative infinity. Right. So if I take 10 to the 200 and multiply it by itself, right, that's 10 to the 400. That's larger than double dot max value. So it becomes double dot positive infinity. Similarly, if I take negative 10 to the 200, multiply it by 10 to the 200, that's negative 10 to the 400, which is more negative than negative 10 to the 308. Right, so that becomes double negative infinity. So instead of wrapping around, everything just becomes some value that corresponds to positive and negative infinity. Now, if you do something, so if you end up with positive infinity or negative infinity, and then end up doing something with it, then usually what you end up with, so you end up doing another calculation with it. Right? So suppose you take x and multiply it by y, right? So you get positive infinity times negative infinity. That gives you negative infinity, right? There are some rules that are defined for arithmetic using infinity. So sometimes when you work with infinite values, you end up with nonsensical results. So those become a value called NaN, so not a number. You can read about all the gory details in the double notebook. It tells you about how NaN is treated and things like that. For the purposes of this lecture, that's not important right now. Python has the exact same issues, right? So Python float behaves exactly the same way as double does. And that's because in both languages, they use there's a standard called the IEEE 754 standard that defines how floating point arithmetic should work on a computer. And we'll see a little bit more about that in 2 or 3 lectures from now. Okay, so that's all I want to say about arithmetic for the time being. There are 3 or 4 notebooks that talk about int values, double values, and arithmetic in Java. So now I want to talk very quickly about functions and how you write what looks like a function in Java. Right, so you know that Python has user-defined functions, right? What's a function? Well, it's just a procedure that you can call to perform specific tasks, right? Here I've got a very strange definition of max. So this Python function computes the maximum value of a and b. Right, now, of course, normally you would just write this as if a is greater than or equal to b, return a, else return b. Right, here I've got a very strange definition that uses arithmetic. Right, later on, so probably not today, you'll see why I've chosen to write max2 this way. All right, so yes, this is strange. No, you shouldn't do it this way. Yes, there's a reason for doing it this way. Right, so it turns out you can compute the max of 2 values by adding them, adding the difference between them. Right, so this is the absolute value of the difference, and then taking that value and dividing it by 2. So mathematically, you can show that this always produces the max. Right? Now, if you want to call max2, right? So perhaps from another module, right? You import whatever module this is living in, right? And then you can just write something like this, right? So x equals max 2, 5, and 3 minus 3, right? So if this function is written correctly, hopefully you expect x to have the value 5. Now Java has no functions, right? So in Python, you can write down this function anywhere you want, right? You can put it in any module that you want to put it in. I thought that doesn't work in Java. So in Java, everything lives in a class or interface, right? So if I want to write this, in this case, Java calls them methods. If I want to write the method max2, I have to put it into a class somewhere, right? So here I've elected to put it in the class lecture2. So like I said, Java does not call what looks like a Python function. It doesn't call them functions. Instead, it calls them methods. So methods always belong to classes. They can also be associated with objects, but we'll get to that a little later on. If you want to write what looks like a Python function, then what you would do is you would write what's called a public static method in Java. Right, so you write public static. In this case, I write int, and then the max2, so the name of the method, right? The parameters of the method, right? So A and B. Now in Java, right, everything has a type, right? So, or all values have types. So you have to say what the type of your parameters are, right? And so A and B, these are just variables that belong to the method max2. So they're variables, which mean they have types. So I have to say that so I have to give them some types. Let's see. So I'm going to describe everything else later on. So right now we can just look at the max2 method quickly. Right? Call the max2 method. A method in another class has to import the class that max2 is defined in. Right? So max2 is defined in the class lecture2. Have another class, the main method in it, right? So here I've got a class called test lecture2, right? So it's a different class. I want to use max2 from lecture2, so I need an import statement to bring in the class lecture2, or to make test lecture2 aware of the class lecture2. Right? So the import statement makes lecture2 visible to test lecture2. Now inside the main method of test lecture2, I can call the max2 method that lives in lecture2. Now to call max2 I have to say what class max2 is in. Right? Even though I imported it, I still have to say lecture2.max2. Right? There is a way to not have to say lecture2, but that's not important today. Right, so to call max2, it's lecture2.max2, and then you pass in the two values that you want to find the max of. Right, and of course you can store the answer in a variable called x in this case. So in Python, indentation is a fundamental part of the language. Right, to write max2, you have to indent these two lines. Right, if you indent them too far, the interpreter might complain. If you don't indent them far enough, the interpreter complains, right? If these are indented a different amount, the interpreter will complain. Java, indentation is used only for readability. So in other words, the compiler, the Java compiler does not care if you indent your code, right? So who cares about your code being indented? Well, the person reading your code cares about your code being indented, right? So generally, right? So when you write the test2, the max2 method, the body of the method should be indented relative to this is called the header of the method. So it should be indented relative to the header of the method. Your methods in your class, they should be indented relative to the declaration of the class. Right? Basically, anywhere you put these braces, right? The stuff inside the braces should be indented one position relative to this. Right, so I've got a brace here. So I indent the body of the method one level of indentation relative to the word public here. Sorry. Okay, So here, I've gotten rid of the indentation and blank lines and so on and so forth. I've added extra indentation here. Don't do this. I will answer what static means shortly. Right, and I've split the line here. Right, you can split lines. That's okay. But you should try to make your the goal is you want to make your code readable. Right, so you don't want to take away space or add extra space where you don't have to. So one thing that some students like to do is they like to double space all of their code. Don't do that. It makes it really hard to read your code. So one of the problems is your code now takes up twice the amount of space that it should. Right, and now you have to scroll your editor to look at a method that might easily fit on one screen. You now have to scroll it. Because now it spans two screens, right? So if you're in the habit of double spacing your code, stop doing that. Right? It makes it much harder to read. Braces. Java uses braces to delimit the bodies of classes, methods, if statements, and loops. The braces are required, right? So you have to have them in Java. The braces are what denote what are called blocks in Java. Right? So the red braces, this is the block of the class. Right? So everything between the red braces belongs to the class. The blue braces, that's the block of the method max2. Right? So everything inside the blue braces belongs to max2, and so on and so forth. Right? You must have the braces in Java. Whether you put the brace here at the end of the line or at the beginning of the next line that's a personal choice. So it's a question of style. If you choose to put them at the beginning of the next line, then you should always put them on the beginning of the next line, right? So don't mix the two styles, right? So don't put the red braces here and then don't put the blue braces here and here. Right. So if you choose to use a different brace location style, then be consistent in how you do it. Okay, so for the time being, all of our classes are public. Right? So public on a top level class. So lecture 2 is what's called a top level class. A top level class is a class that is not inside of another class. Right. So we're not going to see classes inside of other classes until much later in the course. So for the time being, everything's a top level class. A public access modifier on a top level class means that any other class is can see lecture 2. Right. So this thing here is what's called an access or visibility modifier. Right. Public means everything can see lecture 2. Also, for the time being, all of our methods are public and static. So this is going to be true for a couple of weeks at least. So a public method means that the method is callable from within any class that can see lecture 2. Right? So if lecture 2 is public, right, another class can import lecture 2 and use it. Right? A public method inside lecture 2 means that that other class can also call max2. Right? So a public access modifier on a method means that any class that can see lecture 2 can also see max2. Right? And this is very different than Python, right? So Python has no access modifiers at all, whereas Java does have access modifiers. Now, Gurpreet asked, what does static mean? Okay, so again, for the time being, all of our methods are public and static. So when you write a method, you're always going to write public static to begin with, right? So the static modifier on a method, you can't put it on the class. You can't put it on a top level class, but you can put it on a method. So on a method, static means that max2 is associated with the class lecture 2, right? So it already lives inside the class max2, lecture 2, sorry. But a static method is associated with the class that it's defined in, and that means, right, when you call max2, you have to use the class name in front of max2, right? So whoever uses max2 always says lecture2.max2 if the method is static. Now, if the method is not static, right? So if the method's not static, you don't use the class name to call the method. Instead, you use an object of type lecture2. Right. So we haven't talked about objects yet, and we're not going to talk about them for a little bit yet. Right. So for the time being, whenever you're calling a method, class name class name dot followed by the method name. All right. Later on, that rule will change, but for now, that's how you do it. Okay. So the meaning of static will become more clear when we actually start to use objects. So I already mentioned this. So the parameters of a method, those are just variables that belong to the method, right? So A and B belong to the method max2, right? So anywhere inside the body of max2, you can use the variables A and B, right? Now, because they're variables, they have types, right? So here, A and B have the type int. Right. This is also different than Python, right? So Python, you just have two parameters. Right? And the function or method in Python, you can call the function or method by passing in anything you want, right? Whether or not it works is another story, but you can call the method. You can call the function or method. Java methods can only return 0 or 1 value, right? This is different than Python, right? So where Python, you can return a tuple of values, right? So 0 or more values in Python, which is nice. So that's actually really nice in Python. It's convenient that a function or method can return multiple values. Unfortunately, that's not the case in Java, right? So Java can return at most 1 value. If a method returns a value, then it must say what the type of the value it is that is returned, right? So that int in front of max2 says that max2 returns 1 value of type int, right? So it has to appear in, oh, sorry, I screwed that up again. It has to appear in front of the method name, right? And there has to be a space here, right? Returns 0 values, then the return type is void. Right? So void space method name means that main returns no value. If a method returns a value, then there has to be what's called a return statement inside of the method that returns a value. Right? So inside max2, right? Because I say max2 returns an int, somewhere inside max2, I have to have a return statement that returns an int value. Daniel's asking, does that mean you cannot return a list because the list has multiple values in it? No. So a method can return a list, right? But it's still returning only one list, right? The fact that the list contains multiple values is fine, right? But the method can only return one list. So for example, it can't return 2 lists, or it can't return a list and an int, or it can't return a list and a string and a double, right? It can only return one thing, but the one thing can be a list, right? It can also be another object, right? So the object, it can have many things inside of it, right? So that's how, if you want to return something, if you want to return more than one value from a method, you return an object. Okay, so a return statement in Java is similar to a return statement in Python, right? So if you write a return statement in Python, immediately after the return statement, the function stops running and goes back to the caller. The same thing is true in Java, right? So immediately after this return statement, the method max2 stops running, and flow of control goes back to the caller of the method, right? This value here, whatever that is, that has to be an int, or it has to be a value that can be automatically converted to an int, right? So for now, it has to be an int. A void method has no return statement, right? So remember, void means that the method returns no value. So you cannot put return x, for example, here, right? So that the compiler will flag that as an error. Now, what you are allowed to do, though, is you are allowed to have an empty return statement. Okay? So you might wonder, why does a void method Why might you want to have an empty return statement in a void method? So the answer is you might write a method that returns no value, but the method still has to do some error checking on its inputs, right? So for example, you might check, you might have a method that takes in an int x, right? But the method might only work for values of x that are 0 or greater, right? So the first thing you might do in your method is you might check, is x negative? And if so, you immediately return, right? And then the rest of the, if it's not negative, the method continues running, right? So you need some way to stop the method. You need some way to stop the method from running, so you are allowed to have an empty return statement. Okay, that's all I want to say about methods for now. We're going to write more methods when we learn about control flow and things like that, right? So we want to be able to use if statements and for loops to write some more interesting methods. So for now, let's move on to if statements. So an if statement in Python changes the program flow based on one or more conditions, right? I've written, So I've written, I've written a max3 method. So this finds the maximum of A, B, and C, right? So I've got an if statement, right? So the first if statement checks if A is bigger than B and C, right? If it is, then the answer must be A, right? The second one checks if if B is the largest value, right? Now, if A is the largest value, if A is not the largest value, right? And if B is not the largest value, the answer must be C, right? So that's why I have an else clause here, right? There's a very common error, not an error. There's a common thing that students new to programming do. They will write else if C is greater than or equal to A and C is greater than or equal to B, result is equal to C, right? In this case, it doesn't matter. You'll still get the same answer, right? But really, you want to write else here, right? Because this is the third. There's only 3 possible answers, right? So you don't need the third else if. Right? There are built-in max method in Java. There is. It lives in the max. It lives in the math class. No, the math max will only compute the max of 2 values. Right? Python, the max function will compute the max over any sequence. Right? That's not true in Java. So if you want to compute the max of an array, you have to find, you either have to find an appropriate method or write one yourself. I can't remember off the top of my head if there is a max method for arrays. I don't think there is. Anyway. Okay. Now, the corresponding method in Java is going to look a little different, right? Because it's not Java, because it's not Python anymore, right? Notice here, I can, as soon as you declare a variable of type result, right? Python makes that variable for you. So that's not true in Java, right? So in Java, you have to declare the result, and I have to do it here, right? Because I want to use result here, 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 and here, right? The fact that I need to use it down here, right, means I can't declare a result in here. So I'll explain that more later in a couple of slides. Right. Now there are some differences here that you can see, right? So notice that the condition, for the if statements, they have to be in parentheses, right? So the same is true here. Notice that the clauses, right? The if, else, if, and else, they have braces, right? What else do I need to say here? That's it, right? So that's otherwise everything else is, oh, right, and. Notice that and in Java is double ampersand, right? So logical and is and, right? 2 ampersands. Another common thing you'll see with students learning Java is they will use the single and. Don't do that. It works, but it's the single ampersand is meant for what's called bitwise and. You don't want to do that. Right here, you want logical and. So that's double ampersand. Okay, now in both examples, I can get rid of the else clause. Right? What is it? Ethan says declaration and initialization fun. Yes, that's the way it works in Java. It's the way it works in C. It's the way it works in C++. It's the way it works in many languages, right? So the reason you have to do that is because Java's typed, right? So any statically typed language is going to have a declaration and initialization. Oh, I can remove the else clause, right? So I remove the else clause by assuming that the answer is C, right? So here I have declaration and initialization in Python as well. So it's not really that big a deal. So you do the same thing in Java, right? So I can initialize result to be C. That lets me get rid of one else clause. So assume the answer is C, and then change the answer to A or B if I have to. I already told you this, conditions must appear inside parentheses, right? You have to have the parentheses here. If you don't, the compiler will complain. Scope. So I haven't actually told you about this. I've briefly mentioned this. The scope of a variable is where the variable is usable, right? So in a method, you've got the parameters up here, right? So these are considered variables that belong to the method, right? So your parameters, the scope of these methods is the entire body of the method, right? After the method, you can't use them. Right? Declaration, I forgot the Java version of OR. Yeah, I'm gonna get to OR in a minute. Can you explain the declaration and initially? Yeah, sure. Declaration, okay, so on this slide here, double result, that says that there's a variable called result, right? That's all it says, right? I'm trying to remember what happens in Java. I don't remember if you get a default value for a local variable or not. I can't remember exactly what happens. Oh, actually, I do know what happens. So this is a local variable, right? So double result, right, says that there's a variable called result that I can use starting from this point onwards in the method, right? So anywhere inside after the declaration, I can use the variable result, right? However, result has no value at this point in time. Right? So as far as the compiler is concerned, there's something called result. Its value is unknown, right? So if I try to say right here, x equals result or double x equals result, you'll get an error, right? The error will be result has not been initialized, right? Okay, so when I write result equals A, that's fine. So result now has the value A, result now has the value B, result now has the value C, right? You reach this point, right? The compiler can determine, right? The way that this if statement is written, the compiler knows that either this happened, or this happened, right? So it knows that result has been given a value. So returning result is fine, right? Initialization means you declare a variable and give it a value at the point of declaration, right? So that's called initialization. Here, there is no initialization. Result equals A, that's assignment. Result equals B is assignment, result equals C is assignment, right? So initialization does not mean the first time you give a variable a value, right? Initialization means you give the value to a variable at the point at where it was declared. So that's what initialization declaration and initialization mean. Or in Java is the double vertical bar. The single vertical bar is bitwise OR, right? Which is different than logical OR. Scope. So A, B, and C, they're usable anywhere here inside the body of the method, not usable here, right? And you can tell, right? So they're wherever the braces are, that defines the scope of the variable, right? So C, result equals C means result is usable from this point on, right? Inside of the braces where it was declared, right? The parameters are a little bit different. They're declared outside the braces, right? But they actually belong, they're usable at this point here. So the scope of result is the body of the max3 method. Now, here's a problem, right? So here I've got result declared and initialized there. which means I can use it down here, right? Because the scope is the entire body of the method. This does not work, right? So instead of declaring result before the if statement, if I write double result gets the value A inside of the if statement, right? And result is usable only inside of the if statement here. The scope is just this line, which means if I try to return result down here, the compiler complains, right? The compiler says no declared variable named result, right? Similarly here, right? So if I declare result equals B here, right? So double result equals B, that says that there's a new variable called result. Its scope is inside these braces, which means I can't use it here. Okay. So again, compile time error, no declared variable named result. Right. So the scoping issue is one you have to be a little bit more careful about in Java than you do in Python. Now, a method that returns a value has to have a return statement. It is allowed to have more than one, right? However, there cannot be any reachable code after a return statement. So instead of declaring a variable name result, right? If A is the larger of the two values, I can simply return A here, right? Else if B is the larger of the two values, I can simply return B, right? Otherwise, I can simply return C. This is also perfectly fine. What you're not allowed to do, right? And so remember, a return statement immediately stops the method from running, right? So if this line of code runs, right, you are not allowed to have any code here, right? Because that code's not reachable, right? The return statement stops the method from running, right? Any code that you put here would never run anyway. So the compiler looks for that and flags that as an error, right? Similarly here, right? If you return B here, the method immediately stops running. So any code that's here is not reachable, right? And finally, if you return C here, this code's not reachable, which means it's not allowed in Java. Now, some people consider this compared to this, right? Some people consider this to be bad form, right? They consider it to be bad form because it's a little bit harder to trace through this method and see where the method might stop, right? Here, you know that it always stops at the end of the method, right? Here, there are multiple exit points of the method. So some people discourage this style of writing code. In practice, I would say that this style of writing of code happens quite a lot. So in this course, if you want to write code like this, I think it's fine, right? Other people will tell you that it's you shouldn't do it this way. Okay, now you have to remember that your compiler is not a mathematician, right? You know logically, right? If A is bigger than B and A is bigger than C, right? You can return A. If B is bigger than A and B is bigger than C, you can return B, right? Now, I mentioned before that a lot of students will write this, right? So there's only 3 possible answers, but they will write another else if clause, right? So else if C is greater than A and C is greater than B, return C, right? The compiler doesn't like this, right? So what the compiler sees is it sees an if statement, it sees an else if statement, and an else if statement, right? So as far as the compiler is concerned, this line might happen or it might not, right? This line might happen or it might not. And this line might happen or it might not, right? So this line happens if this condition is true. This line happens if this condition is true. This line happens if this condition, this line happens if this condition is true, right? So as far as the compiler is concerned, one of the zero of these lines may not as far as the compiler is concerned, it's possible that none of these happen, right? Even though mathematically you can prove one of them must happen, right? But your compiler does not attempt logical deduction, right? It simply sees if, else if, else if, and says, hey, you can reach this line here, right? The compiler will say that there is the compiler will say that you have a method that returns double, but it does not return a double value. Right. So that's one reason why you should not write that else if here. Right. You should just write else, return C, and then the compiler knows that one of these three things must happen. Right. So be careful about writing your if statements like this, right? If you're returning from inside the if statements, right? Your compiler does a surprising amount of deduction. One of the things it does not do is try to determine mathematically that one of these must happen. Okay, so and is double ampersand, right? Use the double ampersand if you mean and. Okay. Or is double vertical bar. Right? So that's the logical or. Again, if you mean logical or, use the double bar. Do not use the single bar. Just like in math or in logic, and has higher precedence than or. Right? So and will always happen before or if you have multiple ands and ors on the same line. So here I've got an or and an and, right? And that means and happens first, right? So we evaluate this, right? We compute the and of those two values, and then evaluate this, and then compute the or of whatever's here, right? Okay, so this is a method that determines if a year is a leap year, right? So a year is a leap year if it's divisible by 400, right? So if the year is divisible by 400, the answer is true, right? Now, if your year is not divisible by 400, most people think that if it's divisible by 4, it's a leap year, but that's not true. So it turns out the actual rule is it has to be divisible by 4, but not divisible by 100. Right? So for example, the year 2100 is not a leap year. Right? It's divisible by 4, but it is also divisible by 100. So that excludes it from being a leap year. Okay? So if the year is divisible by 4 and it's not divisible by 100, it is a leap year. Right? Now the and has higher precedence, right? So all of this stuff here happens first, which is what you want, right? Mathematically, that's what you want. Programmatically, that's what you want. Okay. Now, trying to remember that and has higher precedence, or parsing or reading a long Boolean expression that's got a bunch of ands and ors in it can be very confusing, right? So you can use parentheses to be explicit about precedence, right? Because parentheses forces the stuff inside the parentheses to happen first, right? Parentheses always have highest precedence. So you may choose to write your method like that instead, right? You may even choose to break the line here and put the second condition right here, so that you can see, oh, this happens or this happens, right? That would be another way to write this. Oh, right. Now this is one way. This is one way that new programmers will write this sort of statement, right? Now what you have to remember is this is a logical expression, right? The stuff inside the if condition is a logical expression, right? So it's either true or false, right? So what this if statement is really saying is if this stuff is true, return true. Right? Otherwise, return false. Right? You should start to train yourself to write it like this instead. Right? Forget the if statement. Just return the result of the logical expression. Right? So instead, return that entire result. Right? Because that's either true or false anyway. Right? The if statement's not necessary. So the problem with this. There's actually not any problem in terms of correctness, right? In terms of correctness, this is perfectly fine. An experienced programmer will read this, though, who reads something like this, will say whoever wrote this is inexperienced, right? And that can lead them to perhaps incorrectly conclude that the rest of your code is also going to be suspect, right? So at some point during your 4 years in undergrad or 3 years, right? You need to transition to writing code like this instead of this. Okay. Both are technically correct, though. The exclamation mark is logical not in Java, right? So in Python, it's the word not. In Java, it's the exclamation mark, right? So if I want to compute the number of days in February for a given year, right, I have to check, is the year a leap year, right? If the year is a leap year, then it has 29 days, right? So if the year is not, right, not a leap year, return 28. Right? So here I'm calling the is leap year method, right? Is leap year method returns true if it's leap year, right? So I'm going to negate the result and return 28, right? So if it's not a leap year, right, return 28, otherwise return 29. That's it for today. All right, I will take any questions if you have them. Anybody? You can unmute or you can type, doesn't matter, whatever you prefer. If you're wondering about getting the notes, I've just finished completing them. I just finished updating them for this term. So those instructions will go up after my next lecture, which is at 12:30. No, there's nothing to do this week. You'll have a lab and an assignment will pop out next week sometime. I have an exam tomorrow. I also have an exam in the middle of next week. So the exam, so the assignment, well, you don't really know enough to do the assignment yet anyway. But you'll get it next week. How do we declare the type of a method? How do we declare the type of method if there is an if condition inside the method returning different types of results? Oh, do you mean can you return two different types from a method? So do you mean can you return an int sometimes and a double sometimes, or a Boolean sometimes? No, you can't do that in Java. Not possible. A method in Java can only return one a thing of one type. You would have to, if you wanted to do that sort of thing, you would have to return an object. And then that object would need some way of telling the caller which value to look at. Yeah, that's an interesting question. I've never been asked that question before. Can you see my cats? I have 5 of them, and I would have to go hunt them down. So the answer for today is no. But at some point, yes, you can see the cats. They're not here right now. If I close my door in 5 minutes, one will show up. But anyway, anything else? All right, great. Let's end there. It's almost 20 after anyway. And I will see you next week.